Welcome to the Heart of Money podcast, where we discuss the impact that money has on every area of your life and where you can learn to make smarter money decisions. Join our conversation as we discuss our past experiences, talk about how to make better money management choices, and in the end, make a commitment to being weird. Hey folks, welcome back to the Heart of Money episode 71. I'm your host, Austin Black, joined by my good friend, longtime mentor. Wait, no, this is Bob Wessler. Sorry, folks, forgot who I was talking to.
I have the same problem every time I look in the mirror. Who is that guy? He is so good. Oh, that is me.
I don't even know what to say to that.
You were already yeah, you don't even know. And we're back.
Well, it is so good to be back with everyone and to be back on the show, to be talking about money, be talking about all the things that go into money. And last episode, we had Randy Bowen just bring a powerhouse conversation about tithing and generosity and in his book on that. And Bob, I am really excited to dig into this. You know, one thing that we have not done a lot, and it's been partly intentional, partly just because of how the show has gone. We have not really talked a lot about the spiritual aspect of money. Now, I know you and I are both believers. We both, have a very strong foundation in Scripture and in just the spiritual aspect of money in our relationship with God. And that's something we haven't dived in or haven't dove into very much. But last episode with Randy really kind of opened up that door, and I think it's a conversation that we need to spend some time on, because even if our listeners, aren't Christians, aren't believers, don't necessarily follow the tithing principles and that specific element, there is always an element of generosity and of giving that it needs to be a part of our life. And I think that that's something that just is very prevalent throughout our society of having that generous attitude. But today and the next episode, we're going to take a direct look at that from the tithing Christian perspective. So hopefully this episode, the next one to come, just enlightens some ideas around that as we kind of dig into the Christian element of money, into the biblical element of tithing, why it's hard, why it's good, why it's beneficial. All of those pieces roll into one. So I'm really excited for this series to continue. Bob, what is something that you have really experienced in the way of tithing and giving and generosity just across the board, because it is kind of that wide ranging topic? Do you feel like this is something that is talked about a lot or isn't really talked about much?
Depends on the circles that you're in and if the subject comes up. I think it's one of those that in some churches, this is talked about at least annually, and they say, how much are you going to give this next year, and write it out in blood, or I guess sign your name in blood or whatever. I never did that. I just refused to. But the church that I went to, that was one of the things they put was, tell us how much we're going to give, and that's their budgeting thing. But I think that in general, it's not talked about much, but then it comes up on rare occasion and can be an interesting conversation. I think it's great to talk about. I think it's one of those things that is definitely an aspect that people hold close to their heart, because again, you're talking about money and you don't necessarily want to share what you do. But then from a biblical perspective, there's sometimes that, don't let one hand know what the other's doing. In a aspect of giving, that it's not that you go out and just, as the saying goes, and as you're used to doing, just making it rain, letting everybody know how much you're giving to everyone. I'm kidding. It's been dry, but multiple aspects there. So I think it's a great topic. It's something to touch on occasion, and a great principle to live by.
And I know, so last episode, we kind of talked about just the benefit of generosity and of giving and of tithing and all these things, why it's such a good practice. But the reality is that, especially in the church, tithing, even though it's biblical, it's very controversial, I feel like. And especially outside the church, it's a controversial topic. You talk to someone who is not, well versed in that concept, in that practice, can kind of strike a real, negative chord with them. And even in the church, sometimes it's like you said, it's talked about sometimes a lot, sometimes a little. It is talked about, but even person to person, I feel like it's kind of a hush hush conversation. You don't talk about your personal tithing outside the fact that you do tithe. And I guess, before we really jump into this conversation around, why it is so controversial, it's probably important that we kind of highlight for anyone who is not familiar with scripture and with biblical principles. The tithing is a practice that is mentioned and is taught in the Bible, and it's giving 10% or first fruits back to God is kind of where the basis stands from it. And you can go find several verses, especially in the Old Testament, but also in the New Testament, that talk about tithing and its relation to um, the giving kind of commandment almost. I mean, it's not one of the 10 commandments, but it is a commandment that God gives to Christians to tithe and to give back the first fruits of your crop, kind of is what it really started from. But it also gives into your finances as well. So for anyone who is not quite familiar with the concept of tithing, that's what it is a tenth or a 10% of your first fruits going back to God. So yeah, as we talk about this tithing concept, especially in the church, but even in secular areas as well, um, it is controversial. It's something that's kind of, it's almost that taboo thing. I hate to use that phrase, but I feel like it is, because whenever we talk about it, it's usually in the general scope of giving to the church as a body, as individual believers within a body, but no one really talks about their personal tithe. And some Christians don't necessarily understand the tithe, or don't feel led to contribute to, or feel like they should contribute more than 10%. Some feel like they should contribute less than 10%. There's so many different elements to this controversy, you might say. Um, that's kind of what the general viewpoint that I've seen from it. Bob, is whenever you hear about tithe, do you feel like it's a controversial topic? Do you feel like it's an open topic? Do you feel like it's something that people get on one side of the fence around? What's your general perspective and people's acceptance to it?
I don't know necessarily. You raised an eyebrow on me when you said controversial, because I thought this was going to get pretty steamy on what goes on and how controversial it truly is. I think the debate that I've always heard is, well, is it pre or post tax? Is it your
Hmm.
total income? Is it your take home? What is it? Um, do you really want to get that nitpicky over it? I think um, yeah, there are those that do, there are those that don't, there are those that don't understand the concept. There are some that give over and above. I think tithing in and of itself is the concept of, here's where you need to start. And
Hmm.
over time, and we've talked about this before, when you develop a habit, it tends to grow. And the hardest part is getting started. And once you have started that habit of tithing, it, on one hand, it gets easier, and on the other hand, you tend to want to try to give more. Um, but the hard part is getting started and saying, oh, and especially like you mentioned a minute ago, in the times that it's hard, that you don't necessarily have the money. Um, and we go back to budgets. Why you put it, that's the first 10% that goes first. If you don't have it, it's awfully hard to give that up when you might not see the benefits of it. And it's going to someone else when you feel like you might need it, or when you feel you do need it. And so,
Right.
but there's a blessing in that from a spiritual perspective. When you give that to somebody else, oftentimes it comes back pretty quick in ways you don't expect.
Yeah, and that's, I know. next episode, we're going to dig into why that you should be giving even whenever you are technically broken in debt. Why that is such an important component, because there there is a spiritual element to giving. Period. It's just, I mean, I know there's been books written about it. There's been many conversations, many talks about it. How there is a spiritual component whenever you give money to a person, to a cause. Just give it away in exchange for nothing in return, right? It's not that transaction. It is honestly being generous, giving away of something. And whenever you do that with money, there's a lot of things good that can happen to you. So I think that's definitely something that a lot of people sometimes have a hard time fully realizing. I know, you know, here it's probably been, well, it's been several months ago. I had posted something on Facebook, and I don't remember what exactly how I phrased it, but it was a question along the lines of, um, "Do you?" Gosh, what was it now? It was like, "Do you believe in um, tithing being your 10% or going above?" It's kind of that question of, what is the benchmark? And because my philosophy has always been, like you said, is that baseline, right? 10%, that's kind of the minimum. And if you want to give above and beyond that, great. But that's kind of where you got to start. But I know some people don't necessarily feel like 10% that's the suggestion, but it's whatever God calls you. And that is where I kind of struggle with understanding that fully. But anyway, so I made this post on Facebook, and one of my friends commented, "You just opened up a can of worms. I got to watch this now," because it was going to spark this conversation of a very strong emotion, opinion, philosophy. And it always interests me how you talk to someone about their giving philosophy or about their tithing, practice, whatever the case is. And people have a hard time talking about money, period. But whenever you start talking about this, it's almost like they either are more than willing to share what they give and how it has benefited people and the blessings of that, or it's, this is my personal thing. I'm not going to share with anyone. It's between me and God. I don't say how dare you ask me, but there's just, it's cut off. There is no response whenever you start talking about the personal tithe, and that's always kind of, I understand it and I respect it, but it also kind of makes me scratch my head like, why? And I think because as a financial coach, I am so open and willing to talk about money. I may not just outwardly say, yeah, I go give, $500 a month to my church. I may not just outwardly say this is what I do, but if you ask me, I'm going to consider, sharing about that, talking about it, because for me, it's personal, but it's also a way to grow and to share and to minister and to witness and to just to um, share my belief in that. So I always have a hard time whenever someone gets very protective around that, just because I don't fully understand the need for that protection. But at the same time, it is very personal. And what really strikes me is the strong opinion around, do you only give 10%? Do you give 10% plus? They have the tithes and the offerings. Do you give above and beyond the 10%? Like you're saying, how do you budget for that, right? Are you going to budget the 10% and then your extra is going to go above that? What is that dynamic in managing it? And then you've also got the people that have the concept of, well, I'm going to give whatever God tells me to give, whatever he leads me to give, which can open up a whole nother conversation around, well, how do you know it's God and not your hesitation? How do you know it's God and not your spouse? How do you know it's God and not you just saying, well, this is what I want to give? What is that dynamic? Because I feel like there is strong teaching that says that 10% kind of is that mark. So there's opinions all across the board within that. I'm kind of, what's your philosophy there in what you heard, what you've seen, what you feel around the whole benchmark and personnel and sensitivity and everything else that happens within that conversation?
Yeah. Um, well, you made it scandalous because you put it on Facebook. So it's such a controversy because your avenue of asking the question. So you're going to get a lot more people that are highly opinionated than those that are just not going to talk whatsoever. So
Right.
there's
That's
the
kind of the
secret.
fun
You put
part
it
of it
on
too.
Facebook. Yeah. Um, I think the 10% is a measure, and it's a general idea. If you're hitting 8%, okay. If you're hitting 12%, okay.
Hmm.
If you're somewhere right around 10, pre post, whatever, again, that kind of goes back to the, you know, between you and God. I think that there's the one aspect of people that say, well, I'm going to give what I feel led to give. Double edged sword there, because sometimes there are people that what they feel led to give is going to be over and above that 10. Um,
Hmm.
it's not necessarily a cop out for somebody that's saying, okay, I'm going to give $1 this week. I'll give $2 next week. And I feel that really God wants me to keep my money. Well, it really came from him in the first place.
Right.
If you're going to look at it and say, that's my money, um, like biblically, Proverbs says, you try to hold on to it, it's going to sprout wings and fly. It's not sticking around. And the easier that you can um, separate yourself from the physicality of money, that who you are is not based on how much money you make, but it is a component of who you are and what you can do. And you've been given that as a steward. We've talked about stewardship before. In God has placed it on you as having certain places that you want to give that money. And it's not necessarily back to your pocketbook that you're wanting to give that money, but you've been given those funds to benefit and bless others. And like I said earlier, there is a blessing in that to others, that you can be to others when you give that, not necessarily through an organized channel or a recurring donation, but when you, and here's where you're saying earlier, when you feel led. We gave money to a gal that had really busted up shoes and just handed her money and said, hey, get some new shoes. There was
Hmm.
more to that conversation, but you could see how overwhelmed she was by it, that she definitely worn out what she was wearing, and um, was a server at a restaurant, and being a server at a restaurant, you need some good shoes, and so that
Right.
blessed her. um, she didn't have to use super glue anymore for her shoes like somebody else I know. But I don't know if she used it or not, but the fact that we were able to bless her and that made us feel good, and she was just overwhelmed. And there are many other situations like that. Do we count that as part of the 10%? No, it's just something to be able to do on a whim that benefits or blesses somebody because you have the ability to do it.
Hmm. I have not used super glue in about 6 months, just so you know.
I know it's gotten so expensive you had to go buy real shoes. No, not real shoes, new shoes. You got all excited about that. I got a good laugh out of it.
More to come on that. It is, and that's such an excellent point too. We're talking about tithing within the church, but giving in general. I mean, it does go above and beyond that, the whole concept. And I think one of the things that I've heard a lot, and I guess I kind of struggle. I don't struggle is not the right word. um, I'm still trying to understand and process it. So I've talked to some people who they have a practice of the 10% tithe, and then they also have a practice of what they call the offering of above and beyond that. If there's something at church, or and I'm gearing all of this towards giving within the church body, within that realm. Not necessarily. It's great to get other people, but I'm kind of, this point in my conversation, I'm centering around giving within a church environment. Um, the offerings that go above and excuse me, above and beyond that 10%. And what I have tried to understand around this, because you mentioned earlier the budget, and the best way to be sure that you are consistently giving is to put the money in your budget. The very first thing, top of the page, mark it in there. But then there's always money that needs to go to savings or investments or living expenses or debt or whatever the case is. I mean, if we're managing money right, if we are being proactive with our funds, if we are doing all the right things and have good income and are managing expenses and everything else, there should be excess each month that we can contribute to those different goals. And what I have tried to understand is if I am in the philosophy of, okay, I'm going to give 10% as my tithe, but then I'm going to also give above that in certain situations. Is that something that I need to budget for subconsciously? Is that something that I just need to be willing to, when the time comes, pull from maybe a savings goal or pull from an investment goal or pull from one of my expense categories where I need to spend less in this category each month so I can give more of that. Obviously, if I feel led to do that, there's going to be areas I need to pull money from, and I totally
Mhm.
understand that concept. But what I don't necessarily understand is like the open ended. Well, I'm going to give 10%, but then I'm also going to plan to give above and beyond that in the right moment, the right time, and that has been something that I've just for me, the way I budget, I don't fully understand how people plan that way. I think it's a great way to plan, but that whole element, because I'm always assigning those dollars somewhere,
Mhm.
somehow, some way, and it may not be to giving. I may just be doing a 10% giving, and then everything else is going to buy a new, an upgraded car, or going to, my retirement, going to my kids' college, going to just an expensive month living, whatever the case is. Um, so that's it that I've always just kind of I understand, I respect, but I'm challenged by how you manage in that capacity, if that makes sense.
Well, that there's another special guest for you to actually dive into that. But I would say that somebody that is going above and beyond that 10, who's budgeting that 10, is also above budgeting to some extent that additional above and beyond. Um, you brought up a good point with giving more. It's got to come from somewhere. So
Right.
you're still looking at it from the frame of budget, that if I'm going to give here, it needs to come from this bucket in order to cover that. And it's all in how you manage a total portfolio, in essence, your whole portfolio of buckets, your
Yep.
300 buckets or your 12 buckets or your 2 buckets, whatever it is. Um, but it goes back to what we talked early episodes on with the 10-10-80 rule of, you give 10%, you save 10%, and the other 80% goes to you for living expenses and how you budget that. So your first two buckets of your budget are tithing and saving, and you can change those up as you want, as you get older, and in most cases are able to make more money. That 10% grows for both of those buckets, or you can change the percentage to more, however you want to do it. um, it's getting into the habit of doing it and then having it to give, and then knowing if you wanted to give more than that, it's coming from somewhere and where that budget works out for it.
Yep. Very good point. So I want to switch gears just a little bit because I feel like there's a lot of conversation, and you mentioned this before. Is it the pre-tax or the post-tax? Is it minimum 10%, or is it whenever I feel like being led to? Whenever it comes to just within the church, people's perspective and commentary and willingness or hesitancy to talk about it. Why do you feel like the tithing of the self, just even that word, sometimes in the church, it strikes a chord with Christians, with believers, with people? It just it makes you have a response. What do you feel like that
um,
response tends to be?
I don't know that, we you mentioned controversial. I think there is a stigma around the word, and it goes to how that word has been used in the past.
Hmm.
The very essence of the word is tenth, 10% of a full harvest in essence. Um, back biblically, when farmers would harvest their crop, they were supposed to leave the edges for the poor and widowed. So that was also, it wasn't necessarily a 10% deal, but they weren't supposed to harvest all of it and take it in, because they were
Hmm.
allowing for others within their community um, to live off what they didn't have to begin with. So um, the concept of community and giving to others is not the hard part. I think, like I mentioned about a church that says, well, you're supposed to give X, tell us how much you're going to give for the next year, and we're in essence making a contract. That rubs me the wrong way,
Hmm.
because it becomes more of a business transaction than it does a heart thing. Now, we'll have people on here that absolutely disagree with me. That's fine. Um, that's just my take on it. That's probably why it's partially controversial, is that I was never one to say, I'm signing this. This is how much I'm giving. Oh, by the way, you've seen that I've given X for the last X number of years, and it's been this much. You have an idea how much I'm going to continue to give into the
Right.
future without me signing my name away on a piece of paper once a year. Um, I think there's a stigma attached to it, basically on how it's been brought up with people, and the necessity of it. Maybe, I mean, you're not going to hell because you didn't give 10% of your um, paycheck, or of what you earn, what comes into your hand. That's that's a side issue. That's a, you know back to Old Testament again. What you had to show, what was best, what made you look good in front of others. Yeah,
Hmm.
that's not eternal salvation. Is based on Jesus Christ, and not on how much money you put in and make a show of it or don't make a show of it. I'm thinking of God. God loves a cheerful giver. Even if you're giving and you don't want to give, your heart's not in the right place. It's all about being able to bless others because you've been blessed in the process, and it is not something that will make or break you um, in eternity and with salvation. But it is something that, yeah, within the church can be used as a weapon, and it's very much not supposed to be that way. But it's supposed to be something that uh, is, again, an outward sign of the blessings that you've received through salvation, to bless others, that they can then see, whether it's within your own community, within your own church, or elsewhere, to be able to spread that love through a tangible asset. Sorry, I preached.
No, that's beautiful, because I think that is so true. That even whenever we're looking at our money, and we say our money is that's not our money, it's God's money that we're entitled to manage and steward and give back to Him. And I think even as Christians, though, that concept seems strange, seems a little bit foreign, seems a little bit um, conflicting, because we know that it isn't our money. We know that we don't have ownership over that money. But I talk to a lot of Christians that don't feel comfortable giving it back to the church. They don't feel comfortable writing that check, for several $100s probably. They don't feel comfortable um, pulling that out of their budget that they are trying to manage, that they are trying to save for. It's just a very it's a struggle for them. And I think to your point, it's a matter of, it's not about the money. It's about the heart and the act. And I think that is why sometimes we get so caught up in, well, is it 10% pre-tax or post-tax? Or is a tithe pre or post-tax? Is it 10% or 12% or 5% or 2% or 25%? I mean, there are so many different opinions to that. But it all comes back to, what is the heart and the impact behind that. And I think in order for us to understand that it's not the money that matters, you have to forget about the fact that I'm giving hundreds of dollars back to the church. I'm taking it out of my account. I'm giving it to the church body, to the board, that probably is going to go towards a salary for the minister. It's going to go towards missions. It's going to go towards utilities for this building. It's going to go towards a bunch of different things that I may or may not fully think is necessary. I may or may not fully understand. I may or may not fully participate in and get the benefit for myself. But it's not about us. It's about what we are giving to and how it's going to impact somebody else. And I think once we can get our heads wrapped around that, we should be more than happy to give whatever amount we're able to,
Mhm.
whether it's 210 or 25. Um, but it's hard to get there, I think, for some Christians, especially for newer Christians who maybe aren't as solid in their understanding of money, or their understanding of scripture, their understanding of just how the church functions and operates, and what our calling is as believers. um, but you and I have both experienced what happens whenever you do give regularly, consistently, abundantly. um, it's life changing, and no matter the amount does not matter. I mean, I always
Mhm.
practice just because of standard rule. I give at least 10% each month. I mean, I give more than 10%, but I'm going to give 10%. That's where we're going to stand. And it becomes that habit that you honestly can't imagine not giving it. It seems
Mhm.
odd when you forget to give it, if that happens. But it's all about that heart. It's all about that desire, that passion that God's put within you to be generous, to be um, just open in that. And I think that's the real key that has to be looked at. It's not how much, it's that you are. Now, I don't think that we can use that as an excuse to not give very much. Of like, well, I'm not, like you said, I'm not called to give a lot. I'm called to give $100 a month. Well, I bet you're probably called to give more than that. You're just being reluctant and not listening. But whatever the case is, I think you got to apply them both together. Of, okay, if I can give 10%, I need to give 10% because that's what Scripture says is a tithe. If I just can't, if the money is just not there, if I am just super tight and I'm going to be able to not afford my light bill if I give 10%, okay, whatever I can give, that generous heart is what really, comes
Mhm.
to fruition and matters. But I think it's a combination that we got to consider both, and we have to stay biblical with the practice and the management of it, and try to give as much as we can, but not wrap our minds around, well, this is 10% or this is not 10%, all right, this is how much it would have been, before or after tax, whatever the case is there. That's where that word, I've been using, the controversy lies, I think, is in how are we approaching that tithe. And I love, how you led into that with the stigma of how it's been talked about before, how it's been perceived and communicated and sometimes preached about. Um, because it's money, and because it's quote unquote religion, because it is, someone say you need to give this, and being told what to do with our money. A lot of emotion goes into that. A lot of different ideas play into that, and a lot of preachers have turned people away from giving because they act like it's a requirement to be saved and be part of the church, and it's not. It's a obedience to
Mhm.
our belief and our being a child of God and being a believer and being a Christian. Um, so that's kind of my rant there on the deal. But I think that you're exactly right in, it's all about what's in your heart, and if you do what's in your heart, but you also follow what we're led to by Scripture in that measurement, you're never going to go wrong, in my opinion.
Yeah. I I think, speaking to a Christian audience, a tithe is not should not be a foreign concept. To your comment about somebody feeling led to give $100, that's great. Give $100 consistently.
Hmm.
Don't give $100, then 3 months from now give another $100. Now, If you have it that you are going to give $100 every 3 months, that's fine. Be consistent with how you're giving. Then, again, the tithe is the goal. It's the generalization. You're looking at a tenth of, and for those that are starting with, I'm not doing any budgeting whatsoever. I need to get on track. I need to be moving towards my goals. Do a 10-10-80. Do a 5-5-90. Do a 15-15-70. Austin, you keeping up with the math? I hope so.
We're at
But
45,
you know,
right?
start there. Yeah, carry the one minus. So be consistent as your goal is to that tenth. If you're not giving that tenth wherever it is, start at 100. Give 101. Give 110. Move up. You can do that. You will see blessings in that. Again, from the Christian perspective, you will get blessings because that blessing was to you in the first place. You worked hard for it, but it had to come from somewhere. It wasn't just because you got up one day and said, I'm going to go get a job, and a job appeared through some avenue.
Mm-hmm.
I think as we get older in life, we realize that there have been opportunities that just were afforded us that were God sends. Um,
Right.
that's going off on a tangent there, but I'm going to the be consistent, give what you can on a regular basis. And hopefully, what I'm going to say now is freeing for some and will probably make some people blow their lid. I don't give 10% directly to the church I attend. I give 10 plus, carry the one again, to ministries and organizations that I feel led to give to. And there I might have hit, I
Mm-hmm.
think Austin might have just turned red too. But, and maybe there's some of that where the churches say you have to give that 10% to this building, to this minister, to this congregation. There is something freeing when you attend a body of believers that say it all comes from God. If you bring it here, fantastic. If you give it to another organization that's going to use it to further the gospel or bless the homeless or put shoes on kids' feet or dig wells on the other side of the world or whatever it is, I think that's where you get into the give where you feel led to give. I think you need to consistently give to your local church, but I don't think it's a hard and fast rule that you have to give 10% to the building you walk in. So, um, again, that's my 2 cents of a tithe of an opinion. And Austin, you may feel very differently about that, but that's why we have
I
these
think that
conversations.
that's a great point, and I'm glad that you brought that up because I think that in itself, there is a lot of opinion around that. And I know whenever Laura and I first got married, we followed that same principle that you have of, well, and at the time, caveat, we didn't have a home church. So, we gave a majority of our 10% to other ministries, to other organizations. We did finally find a home church. We started giving to that, but we still, within that 10%, we had some ministries that we wanted to contribute to regularly, and we didn't think at least that we had the funds to give 10% to the church and then give above and beyond to those other organizations. Now we're to the point now where actually we do give full 10% just goes to our church, and then if we have organizations that we feel led to, that is that above and beyond whatever we have in the budget. So we've kind of done a mixture of all of it.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember that, I and I think that this is an excellent point, and probably exactly what you're talking about. I remember the conversation that I had with Laura. It's probably been 3 or 4 years ago now, where we at that point we were doing. I'm gonna say like maybe it was less than $100 a month that we were giving to outside organizations. They were nonprofit ministries that we had very very close personal ties to, knew the people, wanted to support them, et cetera, et cetera. Everything else, then we were going to the church. And Um, I don't recall if it was a sermon series or where exactly it came from, but I felt convicted that hey, we need to give the full 10% to the church, And if that means we have to stop these other givings, we do that. If that means that we can give in addition to that, we do that. But we need to have 10% to our church. And like you have experienced, it was that very strong calling of this is what we were being led to do. But I've been all across the board in where I give. And I think as long as you feel called, convicted, led, and I don't want to confuse that with preference. I think there's a big difference in, well, I just don't want to give to my church, or I don't have a church to give to. I think there's a big difference in that versus I do truly feel led and called
Hmm.
to give to these other areas because God's also working there. So that we need to distinguish that. But I think that if you have that honest conviction of, man, this is a great organization and I need to give money. This is where God's calling me to give money to. Fantastic. Give money to Him. If you can combine that with your church, amazing. That's what we're called to do. If you make all of that your 10% and you feel that's where God has led you to, you're following God's leading. If you have just 10% to your church and you go other else with the rest of it, like you said, whatever you feel God calling you, not what you want to do, but what you feel God calling you to do. Um, yeah, all across the board, I think that's the most important area.
And and like you said, it's a process. You didn't
Mm-hmm.
start there. You started somewhere, and you've moved to where you've been able to give more. And I think that's a lot of it, is that you get on a consistent habit of doing it, knowing that you should be doing it,
Yep.
but just starting somewhere and starting small. And again, that 10%, they're not asking for 90%, not asking for 75%. It's 10 cents on the dollar.
Mm-hmm.
And if you start with $1, if you start with $10, I mean, being a kid and you got a quarter that you got to put in the plate or
Right.
whatever it is. You start small and you build, just like with budgeting, just like with everything we talk about. You just have to start somewhere and making it a habit, and seeing where it leads and seeing how it's a blessing to others and even to yourself. Um, and continuing to be led, because there are going to be some of those situations. Austin, I'm going to go into another topic here, that in some of those where you give to ministries and there's no response that's, we appreciate it, here's how your
Mm-hmm.
um, giving is benefiting others. I've gone away from ministries because either they don't respond or don't acknowledge, don't show, um, they don't show me anything for what I've given them. Uh, there are others that, and this rubs me the wrong way. Thank you for your gift. Please give more.
Yeah.
Mm, There's some people that can do that. There's some people that might feel led to do that.
Mm-hmm.
But to me, that just rubs me the wrong way. So I think the main message is just, you start somewhere, you give where you can, you give what you have. Again, the 10% being the goal and the starting point. At the same time, is you're going to shoot for that 10 and you're going to get there, but it might take some time if you're not in a position
Yeah.
to do it already. Um, but just being able to consciously work on the habit of giving that, and realizing how it's benefiting others and even yourself.
Amen. And we're not even in church.
Yeah, because we would really just sit down and have. Maybe that's part of the controversy part, is that if we were just sitting down and having a conversation, if we didn't have these microphones, if we weren't talking to others about it and setting this aside, I don't know that we'd have this conversation. It's not really
No,
something
we
we talk
wouldn't.
about, like we said, um, unless there was something on one of our hearts that said, "Okay, here's what I feel led. Here's what I'm experiencing," and then it would be a genuine conversation. And I don't know that it'd be more in depth than this, but it might be a little bit more detailed on what we'd be talking about.
Right.
But I think in most situations, people just don't have one-on-one conversations. So it's good that we had this conversation, for others to be able to hear and kind of process it. And as you said, we're going to talk about it some more, and um, hopefully it's insightful for people.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think, you know, The tithes shouldn't be a controversy. It shouldn't be a debate. It shouldn't be a pressure point. It should be a willing, open act. And hopefully that, through this conversation, we have encouraged people to consider it that way. I'm really excited for next episode where we kind of dig into maybe some of the more personal elements of the tithe. We're just giving in general as we talk about certain pieces of when it's hard to do it, but you still need to do it. So I'm excited for that conversation as well. Bob, great to have you back to be talking with you, and I look forward to next week's episode.
I'm likewise looking forward to it. Good to see you again.